much. I'd like to move on to our third speaker and second critic, Professor Louis Sass, who's Professor of Clinical Psychology at Rutgers.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. This is such an honor to be here in this event sponsored by the Center for Value-Based Practice at Oxford to discuss this excellent book, which is so rich in many ways, and which is written by one of the world leaders in the field of phenomenological psychopathology. As we know, the book focuses on a set of conditions that, despite their profound importance, have not up until now received a great deal of attention in phenomenological circles, the substance use, abuse, or misuse conditions. And it elegantly brings together theoretical issues with clinical, practical concerns. As Anthony Fernandez notes in his fine introduction to the book, it is unusual to have such a highly focused understanding of a condition, in this case, substance misuse, which instead of being treated as a sort of quasi-diagnosis, is rightly understood as a behavioral disposition that may be found in many different contexts and in many different types of people, and that may have a variety of radically different meanings depending on the nature of the individual and the circumstances in question. Indeed, this variety is apparent even in the schizoid and schizophrenic conditions that I'm going to discuss a bit. For as Guilherme notes, different substances can be used for quite opposite purposes by the same individual. As for example, when a schizoid individual uses cannabis to increase the verticality, what Guilherme calls the verticality of his existence, while also resorting to alcohol or stimulants to emphasize the more interpersonally related horizontal dimensions. Now, my comment's going to focus on Dr. Messas's discussion of schizoid and schizophrenic conditions in part 2 of the book. And there, the main focus of the book is on the nature of these conditions or predispositions, with substance abuse coming in a secondary fashion. The issue I wanted to emphasize might be described as the distinction in psychopathology between description and explanation. And also it concerns the distinction between description and explanation, because it has to do with our explanation of phenomena either as defenses or as deficiencies, as what I like to call acts or affliction. That is to say, between conditions we view largely in causal deterministic terms, which would be the afflictions or the deficiencies, versus those understood teleologically as serving a purpose, often a defensive and sometimes an unconscious purpose. My main point will be to pose the question of the extent to which we should think of these unusual experiences and modes of being that we observe in such individuals, as described by Dr. Messas, as involving defensive, self-protective, or truly exploratory motivations versus as resulting from incapacities to constitute the world in a normal fashion. I would note that Guilherme's way of describing things is often somewhat ambiguous, or perhaps better, neutral between these two interpretations of act or defense versus affliction or deficiency. A good example is what he says about schizophrenia, and I quote from the book. The temporality of schizophrenia, I maintain, is shaped by a fragmentation of the structural co-constitution of existence and a correlated loss of protension. And Dr. Messas continues, it is precisely because schizophrenic existence has such difficulty constituting its reality and its own self pre-reflexively that delusion becomes an ontological necessity, end quote. But we could ask, how does this failure to constitute reality in a coherent and consistent fashion come about? Is it a straightforward result of some defects or deficiencies in the very ability to structure time, space, and meaning, or to comprehend the other person sufficiently to live in an intersubjectively grounded universe? Or is there an intentional, perhaps unconsciously intentional element, such as is suggested in the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion's notion of attacks on linking, attacks on linking. Now, Bion's notion, attacks on linking, suggests that even schizophrenic disorganization, often called formal thought disorder, may be largely the result of something intentional or at least quasi-willful on the part of the patient. A person who prefers to destroy any normal form of coherent meaning, says Bion, rather than to risk too much contact with the world, preferring, in Guilherme's terms, the verticality of isolation to the potential risks of horizontality. Dr. Messas's ways of phrasing things often seems to avoid or evade taking a clear stance on this question of act versus affliction. He says the temporality of schizophrenia is shaped. He writes, schizophrenic existence has such difficulty constituting its reality and its own self pre-reflexively. Either we have the passive voice, is shaped, or we have a somewhat abstract, even nebulous subject, schizophrenic existence, to whom it is difficult to ascribe clear agentic value. The emphasis in these formulations might seem to be more on affliction or deficiency. Perhaps, I'm not sure about that. Still, these and other phrasings in Dr. Messas's book maintain a certain ambiguity, we might say, on the act affliction question. And this, I would assert, is actually a fortunate and a desirable ambiguity, given that it avoids adopting any overly extreme stance regarding what is probably a false choice, a choice one might well want to avoid. After all, nearly everything in psychological life probably involves some combination, some complex combination of the two aspects. And it may well be the demands of grammar rather than those of psychological or subjective life that often force us down one path or the other. In any case, this evasion is perhaps typical of much phenomenological description, though not all. And it may be related to the idea of phenomenology as being purely descriptive, as is often said, given that explanation necessarily goes beyond mere or pure description, as Hume and other philosophers have long pointed out. I have argued, and would continue to argue, though, that the opposition between description and explanation is misleading and perhaps even ultimately untenable, and that phenomenology, once it accepts its necessarily interpretive or hermeneutic nature, must and should consider explanatory issues, though in an appropriately sophisticated way. With that in mind, I would note that we seem generally to have an easier time imagining the defensive elements in our conceptualizations of schizoid than of many schizophrenic phenomena. This may be reflected in Dr. Messas's account of schizoid verticality, as he calls it, as in part a project of the person or the patient, or an aspiration, that is an intentional, goal-directed project of setting oneself apart, something that is done by a person rather than something that simply happens to that person. Here, I think Dr. Messas's position has something in common with the vision of British object relations theorists Ronald Fairbairn, Harry Guntrip, and to some extent, R.D. Laing in his book, The Divided Self. We readily understand what Dr. Messas aptly calls the schizoid person's peninsular mode of being in relationship, in human relationships in this light, namely as an accommodation to the desire to stay in isolation, though without cutting off all connection to the mainland of human society. The aptly described phrase from Dr. Messas, numbed hypersensitivity of such persons, and also their peculiar relationship to a body felt to be potentially too exposed to the social gaze, can be understood in this light as a consequence of a willful defending, partly unconscious, partly conscious, of oneself against the dangers felt from the horizontality of the external and social world. The impression of deficit and deficiency is generally stronger, I think, when we turn from anthropopathologies to structural pathologies, using the vocabulary of Dr. Messas, that is, from schizoid personality to schizophrenic psychosis. And when we contemplate such phenomena, most salient in so-called disorganized schizophrenia, of, for example, the fragmentation of time, with the loss of the sense of the normal continuous temporal flow in schizophrenia, or the fragmentation of the perceptual world, the loss of the overall Gestalt-like organized quality of the spatial world, or the disruption of conventional thinking and of language known as formal thought disorder. Should we not consider, however, whether these two might result from something in part act-like, from something akin to a goal-directed attack on linking, which I would argue is often bound up with forms of hyper-reflexivity that result in a disruption of the normal forms of organization and connection with the world and society. So it's worthwhile asking whether even the seemingly most fragmented and disorganized forms of existence might also involve quasi-defensive or goal-directed processes. That's the case with hyperreflexivity, it seems to me, since this involves an, in part, defensive turning inward, which can result in a seeming destruction of normal forms of both thought and perception. Now, in concluding my comment, I want to consider just for a moment the apparent, shall we call it, philosophicality, the philosophical focus that's characteristic of many persons with schizophrenia, something of which Dr. Messas is very aware and discusses in his book. Dr. Messas writes, referring to the above-mentioned forms of disorganized cognition, that all of this causes the schizophrenic to be, quote, forced into close contact with the problems of the constitution of the world. He writes as well, Dr. Messas does, quote, it could be argued that the disorder produced by the structural alteration brings about some existential advantage. Even in a textbook pathological condition, the complexity of human existence does not fail to reveal its contradictions. The disorder forces such individuals into close contact with the problems of the constitution of the world, attracting them to the most extreme themes of existence. And he speaks about epistemological delusions, which, quote, reveal how schizophrenic existence is completely permeated by inquiries into mystery and complexity, end quote. Now, we may ask whether we have the right to interpret these concerns as, did I say end quote? I finished the quotation. We may ask, however, whether we have the right to interpret these concerns as entirely the result of pure or simple deficiencies and afflictions, as purely the outcomes of a breakdown. We might consider the possibility that these philosophical concerns, with the constitution of reality, along with the disorganization of thought, language, and perception, are the consequences of something that is at least in part teleologically or defensively directed, namely a kind of hyperreflexivity. I realize that Guilherme is well aware of these issues, and indeed the sensitivity and sophistication of his understanding of such issues is implicit throughout his book. I am merely bringing them now to the fore, and I look forward, as always with Dr. Messas, to hearing his thoughts regarding these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sass. So, Guilherme, I don't know if you had some comments on that critique.
Yes, thank you very much, Louis, Professor Sass, for these comments. I should say that I'm not honored by having a comment from Professor Sass, but also I need to highlight that one of to me, the core importance of phenomenological psychopathology is exactly make a translation of this philosophical concepts, like, say, ambiguity, like, say, contradictions, to real psychopathological world. I mean, though they are, of course, not easy to use even in philosophical tradition, or mostly in philosophical tradition, they are current in philosophical tradition. I mean, if I may have some help from the the philosophers who are here in this session about the relevance of the discussions of some concepts like ambiguity and contradictions, I'm sure that we would have a rich discussion. On the other hand, we do not have this respect for such concepts in scientific world. I mean, we understand ambiguity or contradiction in scientific world, and I'm interpreting phenomenological psychopathology as a science, as lack of clarity, insufficiency, and something as a side effect of reality that we should cut off our scientific field. I think that this challenge of phenomenological psychopathology, mostly for contemporary needs, is exactly how to bring these concepts to the real world and how the uses of it can be helpful for both science, scientific research, and clinical care. Some part of my effort is exactly trying to point out this in my book and offer some examples of it. I must confess that I build on very strong forerunners. One of them, and I need to recognize, acknowledge this, is Sass' work. I think the concept of the understanding of schizophrenia, core schizophrenia, has simultaneously hyper-reflexivity and alienation. That is something that is plus and something that is simultaneously less in an experience. Is a huge contribution, Professor Sass, Sass, for contemporary schizophrenia research. And this has consequences. If we get, for instance, from Sass, my preferred paper on the consequence for clinical practice of schizophrenia, 2090 paper on the consequences for clinical care of schizophrenia on this consequences on clinical care of this ambiguous concepts. I think we can experience, if you get to these contributions, I think we can experience exactly the relevance of phenomenological psychopathology to current clinical practice. So, what does it mean? It means that your sentence that something is part something and part something else, that is dependent on the light we shed on it, and it is a clinical issue. It is a practical issue with practical consequences, depending on the totality in which it emerges, in the personality, in the context, some experience, pathological experience emerges, and depending on the light we shed, the light shed on it, we see such a phenomenon, the very phenomenon, as part of something or part of something else. And this is extremely relevant for our needs today.